Close your eyes and let yourself drift back through time, Back to the autumn of 1793, when the Mediterranean coast of France echoed with the distant rumble of cannon fire and the whispered promises of revolution. Listen closely, Can you hear it? The gentle lapping of Mediterranean waves against the ancient stones of Toulon's harbor. The year is 1793, and the salt-tinged air carries more than just the scent of the sea. It carries the tension of a nation divided, the weight of revolution, and the dreams of a young artillery captain whose name will one day echo through the corridors of history. Picture yourself standing on the rolling hills surrounding this coastal jewel of southern France. The morning mist clings to the cypress trees like ghostly fingers, and in the distance, the red-tiled roofs of Toulon catch the first rays of dawn. 28,000 souls call this place home, their lives intertwined with the rhythm of the tides and the creaking of ship masts in the harbor below. But something is different this September morning. Where once flew the tricolor flag of the Republic, now foreign banners snap in the coastal breeze. British ships of the line rest at anchor like sleeping giants, their black hulls reflecting the golden morning light. Spanish vessels crowd the harbor alongside them, their ornate sterns bearing the royal arms of distant kingdoms. Feel the cool morning air on your skin as you imagine walking down the cobblestone streets of old Toulon. The clip-clop of horses' hooves on stone, the creak of wooden cartwheels, the distant call of seabirds circling the harbor. This is a city caught between worlds, between the old regime and the new, between monarchy and republic, between the safety of compromise and the dangerous dream of revolution. The citizens who remained loyal to the radical Jacobin in Paris fled weeks ago, their footsteps echoing through narrow alleyways as they sought refuge in the countryside. Those who stayed, royalists, moderates, and the simply frightened, now found themselves under the protection of foreign powers, their fate tied to the success or failure of the coalition that had promised to restore order to France. Let your mind wander back to that turbulent summer of 1793. Picture the dusty roads leading south from Paris, where urgent dispatches carried news that would chill the hearts of revolutionary leaders. In the capital, the guillotine's blade fell with mechanical precision on the Place de la Révolution. King Louis XVI had met his fate in January, and now the revolution devoured its own children with increasing hunger. The moderate Girondins had fallen in June, leaving power in the hands of the uncompromising Jacobin, led by the pale, incorruptible figure of Maximilien Robespierre. But the revolution's troubles extended far beyond the borders of Paris. Across Europe, monarchs watched the events in France with growing alarm and determination. Austria and Prussia, already at war with the Republic since 1792, had been joined by a formidable coalition. Great Britain with her mighty navy, Spain with her vast empire, and the Dutch Republic with their merchant fleets. These powers had formed what history would remember as the First Coalition, united in their desire to crush the dangerous ideals spreading from French soil. Imagine the war rooms of London, Vienna, and Madrid, the scratch of quill pens on parchment as ambassadors drafted treaties, the rustle of maps being unfolded across, mahogany tables, the whispered conversations of men planning the fate of nations, Even more dangerous than foreign enemies were the rebellions sprouting within France itself. Lyon, that great industrial city of the East, had thrown off its Jacobin administrators. Bordeaux, the wine capital of the Southwest, had done the same. Marseille, the bustling port that served as gateway to the Mediterranean, had followed suit. These Federalist revolts represented more than mere political disagreement. They threatened to tear the young republic apart from within, creating a patchwork of competing authorities where once a unified nation had stood. It was into this chaos that General Jean-Francois Carteau rode south with his hastily assembled army. A painter by trade before the Revolution transformed him into a soldier. Carteau carried with him the desperate hopes of the National Convention. His mission was clear: bring the rebellious cities back into the Republican fold, by persuasion if possible, by force if necessary. Picture the dusty columns of Republican soldiers marching through the Provencal countryside, the rhythmic thud of boots on ancient Roman roads, the jingle of equipment and the snort of horses ... the tricolor flags snapping in the warm southern breeze. The rebels in Avignon put up little resistance. The city fell on July 25th with barely a shot fired, its defenders melting away like morning mist before Carteau's advance. Marseille proved only slightly more difficult. Surrendering a month later to avoid the destruction, it would surely follow a prolonged siege. The victorious Republicans flooded the city with Jacobin newspapers and pamphlets, while the guillotine worked overtime to deal with the rebellion's leaders. But as Carteau prepared to continue his march toward Toulon, riders brought him news that would change everything. The port city had not simply rebelled, it had invited in the enemy. British and Spanish fleets now crowded its harbor. Foreign soldiers patrolled its ramparts, and with them sat the entire French Mediterranean fleet, 26 ships of the line, and countless smaller vessels, representing 1/3 of France's naval power. Feel yourself transported to that fateful night of August 24th. The gentle splash of oars cutting through dark water ... the creak of rope and timber as a small boat approaches Toulon's moonlit quay. Lieutenant Edward Cook of the Royal Navy pulled his boat through the shadows cast by the towering French warships. Admiral Lord Samuel Hood had chosen him for this delicate mission, to slip into the rebellious city under cover of darkness and determine whether the Royalists' offer of alliance was genuine or an elaborate trap. The French fleet lay at anchor like sleeping sea monsters, their gun ports closed, their decks seemingly empty. But Cook knew that Admiral St. Julien and his sailors remained loyal to the Republic, and discovery would mean capture, imprisonment, or worse. The lieutenant's heart pounded as he guided his small craft between the massive hulls, their copper-sheathed bottoms gleaming dully in the starlight. Listen to the gentle lap of waves against the harbor walls, the distant sound of church bells marking the midnight hour, the whispered conversations of sentries on the ramparts above. As Cook stepped onto the quay, rough hands seized him. Jacobin sympathizers, still numerous despite the Royalist takeover, had spotted the British officer. They dragged him through narrow streets that echoed with angry voices and the sound of running feet. But before the mob could deliver him to the Republican authorities, other figures emerged from the shadows, Royalists who had been expecting his arrival. The meeting that followed would change the course of the siege. In a candlelit room overlooking the harbor, Toulon's Royalist leaders made their desperate bargain with the British crown. They would hand over not just their city, but the entire French Mediterranean fleet, in exchange for protection and a promise that all would be returned when the war ended. It was a devil's bargain born of desperation, but for men who saw the guillotine's shadow growing longer each day, it seemed their only hope. Cook carried these terms back to Admiral Hood aboard HMS Victory, that legendary ship of the line that had carried Nelson to glory at Trafalgar, though that triumph still lay years in the future. Hood needed no time to consider. The offer was too valuable to refuse. The capture of Toulon and the French fleet would cripple Republican naval power in the Mediterranean and provide a crucial base for coalition operations. Picture the early morning of August 28th. The creak of rigging as British ships prepared to enter the harbor. The splash of anchors dropping into the clear Mediterranean water. The sound of boat crews rowing toward shore ... Hood's men occupied the western heights overlooking the harbor without firing a shot. Point L'Aiguillette, that crucial promontory that commanded both the inner and outer anchorages, fell into British hands as easily as picking fruit from a tree. Admiral St. Julien, realizing that his position had become untenable, slipped away with those sailors who remained loyal to the Republic, leaving the magnificent French fleet as a prize for Hood's taking. 19 British ships of the line sailed into Toulon's harbor in a display of naval power that must have awed the watching citizens. HMS Victory led the line, her 3 decks bristling with cannon, her Union Jack streaming proudly from the mainmast. Behind her came 17 Spanish vessels under Admiral Juan de Langara, their ornate sterns carved with heraldic devices that spoke of old-world grandeur. Neapolitan and Piedmontese troops added their strength to the coalition garrison, though the total force numbered only 16,000 men, a thin shield to protect such a valuable prize. Close your eyes and let yourself drift along the dusty roads of Provence, September 16, 1793. The clip-clop of horse hooves and the creak of wagon wheels laden with gunpowder. Among the convoy making its way from Marseille to Nice rode a young officer whose destiny would soon intertwine with that of Toulon. Captain Napoleon Bonaparte, 24 years old and burning with ambition, was escorting precious powder supplies when duty and opportunity converged at General Carteau's headquarters. Bonaparte had come to pay his respects to Antoine Salicetti, a deputy of the National Convention whom he had known during his days in the Corsican National Guard. Salicetti, serving as a representative on mission with the army, had been impressed by Bonaparte's recent pamphlet, La Super de Beaucaire, a fiery defense of Jacobin policies that had earned the young Corsican favorable attention in Paris. Imagine the scene: the general's tent filled with the smell of camp coffee and tobacco smoke. Maps spread across a wooden table, their edges weighted down with pistols and sabers. Officers in blue coats bent over dispatches from the capital. When Bonaparte mentioned his artillery experience, Salicetti's eyes lit up. General Carteau desperately needed an artillery commander. His previous chief gunner, Captain Damardin, had been seriously wounded in a skirmish with coalition scouts. The Republic was short of reliable officers. Many had fled the country or fallen victim to the revolutionary tribunal's suspicious scrutiny. But here was a young captain with the right credentials and, more importantly, the right political sympathies. The appointment was made on the spot. Captain Bonaparte, who had arrived as a simple convoy escort, suddenly found himself in command of the Republican artillery train. It was a modest force: 2 24-pounder cannons, 2 6-pounders, a handful of mortar, and several smaller field pieces, all supported by an inadequate supply of ammunition and powder. But for an ambitious young officer, it represented opportunity, and Napoleon Bonaparte never let opportunity slip through his fingers. Feel the excitement in the air as Bonaparte surveyed his new command: the metallic scent of cannon bronze, the rough texture of hemp rope, the weight of military responsibility settling on young shoulders. Within days, Bonaparte had constructed his first batteries on a hillside overlooking Le Petit Raid, Toulon's inner harbor. He christened them with patriotic names that reflected the revolutionary fervor of the times: La Montagne, after the radical faction in the National Convention, and Des Sans-Culottes, in honor of the working-class revolutionaries who had driven the monarchy from power. On September 20th, these batteries opened fire on the coalition ships anchored below. The sudden bombardment sent the Allied fleet scrambling for safety, forcing them to crowd closer to Toulon's quays, where they would be trapped if the situation deteriorated further. Bonaparte watched with satisfaction as his cannonballs splashed around the enemy vessels, some finding their mark with satisfying crashes of splintering timber. But the young artillery commander's keen eye had already identified the key to victory. The western heights that rose above Toulon commanded both the inner and outer harbors with their elevation. If he could establish a battery on those heights, he could rain down destruction on Hood's fleet from above, making their position untenable. The British admiral would face a terrible choice: withdraw and abandon Toulon, or watch his precious ships of the line be smashed to kindling by plunging fire. Bonaparte took his plan to General Carteau, who approved it with enthusiasm. All that remained was to drive the coalition forces from the heights they had occupied so easily a month before. Picture the pre-dawn darkness of September 22nd. The rustle of equipment as French soldiers prepared for their assault. The whispered prayers of men about to face enemy fire. General Carteau's attack began with high hopes, but ended in bloody failure. The general, perhaps overconfident after his easy victories at Avignon and Marseille, sent too few men against positions that had grown stronger with each passing day. The French assault waves broke against the coalition defenses like ocean swells against granite cliffs, leaving the slope littered with blue-coated bodies. Listen to the sounds of battle fading into the distance. The groans of wounded men. The retreat drums beating sadly in the Mediterranean dawn. Admiral Hood reacted swiftly to the failed assault. If the French wanted the western heights badly enough to attack them, then those positions must be held at all costs. Additional troops and equipment flowed to Point Legolet and Point Balaguer, where British engineers began constructing a formidable earthwork that would dominate the approaches from land and sea. The new fortification mounted 20 heavy cannons and 4 mortar, its earth and timber walls designed to absorb the impact of enemy shot while protecting the guns within. Hood's officers christened it Fort Mulgrave, but the French soldiers who stared up at its menacing silhouette gave it a different name, Little Gibraltar. Like its famous namesake guarding the entrance to the Mediterranean, this fortress seemed impregnable, a rocky barrier between the Republicans and their goal. Feel the autumn sun warming your face as you imagine standing with Bonaparte on the hills above Toulon. The scent of wild thyme and rosemary carried on the sea breeze. The distant sound of hammers and saws as coalition engineers strengthened their defenses. But Napoleon Bonaparte was not a man to accept defeat. If Little Gibraltar stood between him and glory, then Little Gibraltar must fall. But first, he needed more guns, many more guns. The young artillery commander threw himself into the task of building a proper siege train with the single-minded intensity that would characterize his entire career. He wrote letters to every town and city within 100 miles, requisitioning cannon, shot, and powder with a mixture of revolutionary authority and barely veiled threats. The recently rebellious communities around Marseille found themselves forced to contribute horses and equipment as penance for their brief defiance of Republican rule. Bonaparte's correspondence flowed to Lyon and Grenoble, to the Army of Italy, and even to workshops in distant provinces. He established an arsenal at Orleans, where 80 men worked day and night, casting cannonballs and mixing gunpowder. His energy seemed inexhaustible. He inspected gun positions at dawn, supervised the construction of batteries during the day, and spent his evenings planning the next day's work by candlelight. Imagine the controlled chaos of Bonaparte's headquarters. The scratch of quill pens on paper as clerks copied endless requisitions. The tramping feet of messengers carrying orders to distant towns. The rumble of wagons bringing fresh supplies to the siege lines. By late October, Bonaparte's efforts had transformed the Republican artillery from a modest collection of field pieces into a formidable siege train. 64 officers and 1,500 men served 100 cannons, howitzers, and mortar of various calibers. It was a remarkable achievement, accomplished through sheer force of will and organizational genius. But Bonaparte's methods had not gone unnoticed. He had bypassed his immediate superiors, writing directly to the Committee of Public Safety in Paris when local commanders proved too slow or too cautious. His disdain for General Carteau, born of the failed September assault, was shared by Deputy Salicetti, who worked behind the scenes to have the former painter dismissed. Carteau's replacement, General Francois Dopet, proved no more competent than his predecessor. On November 15th, Dopet ordered a new assault on Fort Mulgrave that began with promise but ended in frustration. French troops succeeded in driving Spanish defenders from the right side of the fortress, but when Dopet's aide-de-camp was killed beside him, The general panicked and ordered a premature retreat, just as victory seemed within reach. Picture Bonaparte's fury as he watched the withdrawal. His fists clenched as opportunity slipped away. The bitter words he spoke about commanders who lacked the courage of their convictions. "Our blow at Toulon has missed," Bonaparte raged, "because an expletive has beaten the retreat." The young captain's frustration was palpable. Twice now, inadequate leadership had cost the Republicans their chance to end the siege quickly. Feel the change in the air as November 17th dawned. The sound of horses arriving at Republican headquarters. The crisp commands of a professional soldier taking charge. General Jacques Dugommier brought with him not only fresh reinforcements, but something even more valuable: competence. Unlike Carteau and Dapet, Dugommier was a veteran commander who had earned his rank through skill rather than political connections. Bonaparte recognized the difference immediately, later calling Dugommier a rare officer, high praise from a man not given to flattery. Dugommier returned the compliment, quickly recognizing Bonaparte's exceptional abilities and giving the young artillery commander the support he needed to implement his plans. With the arrival of additional troops, the Republican army swelled to 37,000 men, while Houde's garrison had dwindled to just 12,000 effectives as disease took its toll and promised reinforcements failed to arrive. Listen to the sounds of an army preparing for its final effort. The ring of hammers on metal as gunners adjusted their pieces. The scrape of shovels as engineers dug approach trenches. The quiet conversations of soldiers who knew their moment was approaching. Between October 15th and November 30th, Bonaparte constructed 11 batteries that formed a deadly web around Toulon's defenses. 8 batteries targeted Fort Mulgrave itself, their guns positioned to create a devastating crossfire that would make the fortress untenable. 2 more batteries aimed at Fort Malbousquet on the northern shore of the inner harbor, while the 11th prepared to bombard Toulon itself. 1 battery, positioned directly below Little Gibraltar, earned a particularly grim reputation. The initial gun crews sent to establish it were all killed or wounded by enemy fire, creating a superstitious dread among the artillerymen. Bonaparte solved the problem with typical flair, renaming it Batterie des Hommes Sans Peur, the battery of the men without fear. Suddenly, volunteers stepped forward eagerly, unwilling to let anyone question their courage. Picture Bonaparte himself, working beside his men. The weight of a ramrod in his hands as he helped load a cannon. The blood of a fallen gunner staining his uniform. The respect of soldiers who saw their commander share their dangers. When a gunner was killed beside him, Bonaparte immediately picked up the man's blood-soaked ramrod and helped finish loading the piece. Such gestures, repeated countless times during the siege, endeared him to the common soldiers who came to see their young captain as a leader worth following. Close your eyes and feel the tension building as November 25th arrived. The serious faces of officers gathered around Dugommier's map table, the weight of decision hanging in the candlelit air. The war council that met that evening faced a crucial choice. Winter was approaching, bringing with it the storms that would make naval operations increasingly difficult. If Fort Mulgrave was to be taken, it must be soon, before the season turned completely against them. The decision was unanimous. One final assault would be launched against Little Gibraltar. If it succeeded, Bonaparte's plan could finally be implemented. If it failed, the siege might drag on through the winter months, giving the coalition time to bring up reinforcements and strengthen their defenses. But the Allies had plans of their own. On November 30th, as the Republicans made their final preparations, 2,200 coalition soldiers launched a surprise sortie from Fort Malbousquet. Led by British General Charles O'Hara, the mixed force of British and Neapolitan troops swept across the landscape in the pre-dawn darkness, overwhelming a French battery and spiking its guns before the defenders could react. Imagine the chaos of the surprise attack, the flash of musket fire in the darkness, the shouts of confused soldiers roused from sleep, the drum beats calling Republicans to arms. General Dugommier responded with characteristic speed, personally leading a counterattack that crept along a trench concealed with olive branches, until the French were within range of their objective. When the Republicans opened fire, the Allied soldiers panicked, shooting wildly at shadows, while Bonaparte organized a charge that recaptured the battery and sent the raiders fleeing back to their fortress. Among the prisoners taken was General O'Hara himself, wounded in the arm during the fighting. It was a moment rich with historical irony. 12 years earlier, O'Hara had been chosen to surrender Yorktown to George Washington and the American rebels. Now he found himself surrendering to another young officer whose name would one day echo through history. O'Hara thus became the only man to personally surrender to both Washington and Napoleon. Feel the electric anticipation as December 17th approached. The final preparations being made. The prayers whispered in the pre-dawn darkness. At 1 o'clock in the morning, following an intense artillery bombardment that lit the night sky with flashes of orange fire, Dugommier ordered the final assault. French soldiers advanced through icy winds and driving rain, their faces set with grim determination as enemy grapeshot cut through their ranks. The first column, led by Claude Victor Perring, who would one day become a marshal of Napoleon's empire, broke through Little Gibraltar's outer defenses, but was stopped at the second line of earthworks. Bodies piled up in the muddy approaches as French courage met British determination in a deadly embrace. At 3 o'clock, as the first attack stalled, Bonaparte himself led the second assault. His horse was shot from under him, crashing to the ground in a tangle of thrashing limbs and screaming metal. A British bayonet found its mark, sending a lance of pain through his thigh, but the young captain pressed on, his men following him into the teeth of the enemy fire. Picture the moment of victory. The French tricolor rising over the captured ramparts. The cheers of soldiers who had paid dearly for their success. The sight of coalition defenders fleeing toward the harbor. Fort Mulgrave fell, and with it the Allied positions at Point Leguillet and Point Balaguer. Despite his wound, Bonaparte supervised the construction of new batteries on the captured heights, and by the afternoon of December 18th, 10 guns were in position and ready to rain destruction on Hood's fleet below. Additional batteries on Mount Ferran and Malbousket completed the trap. The coalition position had become untenable. Listen to the urgent conversations aboard HMS Victory as December 18th turned to night. The creak of the ship's timbers. The splash of waves against the hull. The tense voices of officers planning their withdrawal. Admiral Hood's War Council faced an impossible situation. The French guns now commanded every approach to the harbor, making it suicidal for the fleet to remain. The decision was made to evacuate immediately, but first, the French ships must be destroyed to prevent them from falling back into Republican hands. Sir William Sidney Smith volunteered for the most dangerous part of the mission. The young naval officer, commanding the sloop Swallow, would lead a small force into the arsenal to destroy as many French vessels as possible, while Spanish boats dealt with the powder hulks anchored in the outer roads. Picture the tension of that December night, the dark waters of the harbor reflecting the stars, the creak of oars as Smith's boats approached their targets, the watchful eyes of 800 freed galley slaves guarding the arsenal. Smith's men worked by torchlight, placing explosive charges on the magnificent French ships of the line that had once been the pride of the Mediterranean fleet. The freed galley slaves, sympathetic to the Republic, watched suspiciously, but did not interfere, as Smith kept a loaded gun trained in their direction. At 10 o'clock, the fuses were lit. The night erupted in spectacular destruction, as ship after ship caught fire, their masts and rigging outlined against the orange flames like the skeletons of prehistoric beasts. Republican batteries, alerted by the glow, opened fire on Smith's boats as they attempted to escape, and 2 were destroyed with their crews before the British officer could reach the safety of the outer harbor. Meanwhile, Spanish demolition teams had reached the powder hulks. When the charges exploded, the night sky lit up like day, and the shock waves rattled windows throughout Toulon. Smith had not destroyed as much of the French fleet as he had hoped, but significant damage had been done to prevent the Republicans from immediately using their recovered naval assets. Feel the panic that gripped Toulon as December 19th dawned. The sound of running feet on cobblestones ... The cries of frightened civilians. The distant rumble of Republican drums. As the French fleet burned in the harbor, British ships stood by to evacuate coalition troops and as many French royalists as possible. 14,877 citizens of Toulon crowded onto the decks of the evacuation vessels, their faces turned away from the only home many had ever known. The scene at the waterfront was heartbreaking. Families torn apart as some chose exile while others remained behind. Children crying for parents who could not be found in the chaos. Old men and women who could not bear to leave the graves of their ancestors. The lucky ones made it to the boats. Others were trampled in the desperate rush or cut down by Republican soldiers who had entered the city as the last ships pulled away from the quays. Listen to the sounds of tragedy. The splash of bodies in the harbor, the crack of musket fire, the screams of those who chose death over what they feared would come. Some royalists, seeing the Republican soldiers approaching and knowing what fate awaited them, threw themselves into the sea rather than face the revolutionary tribunals. They preferred, as one witness wrote, instant death to infuriated vengeance. For those who remained behind, that vengeance was swift and terrible. Under the supervision of Jacobin representatives like Paul Barras, between 700 and 800 royalist prisoners were marched to the Champ de Mars, Toulon's parade ground, where they were shot or bayoneted to death without trial. The blood of civil war, so long contained, finally flowed freely through the streets of the recaptured city. Picture young Bonaparte, wounded but victorious, watching from his hospital bed as the drama concluded, the weight of destiny settling on shoulders that had proven strong enough to bear it. Napoleon Bonaparte, recovering from his bayonet wound, did not participate in the massacre that followed Toulon's recapture. But he had played the crucial role in the city's fall, and the Republic rewarded him accordingly. On December 22nd, just 3 days after the siege ended, Captain Bonaparte became Brigadier General Bonaparte at the age of 24. The Siege of Toulon had lasted from August 29th to December 19th, 1793, 112 days that changed the course of both the French Revolution and European history. The Republic had been saved from the loss of its Mediterranean fleet and a crucial naval base. More importantly, a future emperor had announced his presence to the world. As our story draws to a close, let yourself drift on the gentle Mediterranean breeze. Feel the warmth of the southern sun on your face. Listen to the peaceful sound of waves washing against Toulon's ancient harbor walls. In the weeks that followed the siege's end, as winter settled over the Provençal coast, the full significance of what had transpired became clear. The French Republic had survived its greatest crisis. The coalition's strategy of supporting internal rebellions had failed, and a new generation of military leaders had emerged from the crucible of revolutionary war. For Napoleon Bonaparte, Toulon was the first step on a journey that would take him across Europe and into the pages of history. The tactical genius he displayed in positioning his batteries, the organizational skills he demonstrated in building his artillery train, and the personal courage he showed in leading the final assault, all these qualities would serve him well in the campaigns to come. Picture the young general in the months that followed, planning new campaigns by candlelight, studying maps of Italy and the Rhine, dreaming of glories yet to be won. Within months, Bonaparte would be commanding the army of Italy, winning a series of brilliant victories that would make him the most famous soldier in Europe. The Siege of Toulon had been his audition for greatness. The Italian campaigns would be his first starring role in the grand drama of the Napoleonic Wars. But on this quiet Mediterranean evening, as the last light fades from the western sky and the first stars appear above Toulon's harbor, we can imagine a moment of peace. The guns are silent, the wounded are healing, and somewhere in the hills above the city, a young general dreams of empire. Let the gentle rhythm of the waves carry you toward sleep. Feel yourself drifting on the currents of history. Rest now as the Mediterranean keeps its eternal watch over the shores where destiny was born. The year 1793 is ending, but the legend of Napoleon is just beginning. From the batteries above Toulon's harbor to the throne of France, from the tactical genius who positioned his guns with mathematical precision to the emperor who would reshape the map of Europe, it all began here, in the autumn of the Republic's greatest peril, when a young artillery captain seized his moment and changed the world. Sleep now and dream of distant thunder, the echo of history being made, the whisper of destiny fulfilled.